Have you ever felt the weight of history pressing down on you like a physical force? Ever stood on land where unspeakable suffering occurred and felt something ancient and unresolved watching you from the shadows? In 1839, Charleston, South Carolina, a discovery was made that would challenge everything the residents thought they knew about the power of human will, the bonds of sisterhood, and the true nature of curses. Before you continue watching this video, please take a moment to comment below and tell me where you're from. Your participation helps our channel understand our audience better, and if you haven't subscribed yet, we need your support to continue bringing these hidden historical horrors to light. Please subscribe now to help us uncover more of these forgotten nightmares. It was an unusually cold February morning when the discovery was made. Workers had been hired to excavate the foundation for an extension to the prestigious Blackwood Manor, one of Charleston's most prominent plantations. As their shovels bit into the frost-hardened earth behind the main house, near where the old slave quarters had once stood, one of the workers, a man named Samuel Jenkins, struck something that rang with a metallic sound rather than the dull thud of stone. "Hold up!" he called to the others. "There's something here." The workers gathered around as Jenkins carefully scraped away more soil, revealing what appeared to be a metal chain. But as they continued to dig, following the length of the chain, a collective gasp rose from the group. The chain was attached to a manacle, and the manacle encircled the wrist of a human arm. Work halted immediately, and a messenger was dispatched to fetch the plantation's owner, Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood, as well as the local authorities. While they waited, the workers stood in tense silence, no one willing to continue disturbing what was clearly a grave. When Colonel Blackwood arrived, his face betrayed no emotion as he surveyed the scene. At 65 years of age, he was a third-generation owner of the plantation and one of the wealthiest men in the state. Known for his calculating mind and icy demeanor, he had doubled the plantation's wealth since inheriting it from his father 30 years prior. "Continue the excavation," he ordered after a brief inspection, "but carefully. I want to know what we're dealing with." By the time Sheriff William Harlow arrived with 2 deputies, the workers had exposed not one but 2 bodies, buried side by side in what appeared to be a deliberate grave. Both were female, their skeletal remains still clad in the tattered remnants of simple cotton dresses. And both were bound in iron chains that had been broken at several points, the metal sheared through as if by enormous force. "What in God's name?" Sheriff Harlow muttered, removing his hat as he stared down at the grim discovery. Colonel Blackwood stood at the edge of the excavation, his hands clasped behind his back. "It appears we've uncovered something rather unusual, Sheriff. I trust you'll handle this with the appropriate discretion." Harlow shot Blackwood a hard look. Though the sheriff's position required him to maintain cordial relationships with the wealthy plantation owners, he had never much cared for Blackwood's cold arrogance. "These were your slaves, I assume?" Harlow asked, gesturing to the chains. "Perhaps," Blackwood replied carefully, "but this estate has been in my family for over 70 years. These remains could date back to my grandfather's time, or even before." One of the workers, an older black man named Isaiah, who had been born on the plantation, stepped forward hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but I believe these might be the remains of the Freeman sisters." All eyes turned to Isaiah, who seemed to shrink under the sudden attention. Colonel Blackwood's expression darkened. "You're overstepping, Isaiah." But Sheriff Harlow was already interested. "Who were the Freeman sisters?" Isaiah glanced nervously at Blackwood, then back to the sheriff. "It was before my time, sir, but my mama told me stories. 2 sisters brought here from Haiti around 1815 or so. They weren't like the others, had strange ways about them. The old folks said they knew things, had powers." Blackwood scoffed. "Superstitious nonsense." The man's mother filled his head with ghost stories. "With all due respect, Colonel," Sheriff Harlow said, "I'd like to hear what Isaiah has to say." He turned back to the elderly worker. "Go on, sir." Isaiah nodded, his weathered face solemn. The story goes that they were twins, born during a lightning storm in Haiti. Their mama was said to be a powerful mambo, a priestess. The sisters were called Adeline and Josephine Freeman. They were purchased by the colonel's father, the late Augustus Blackwood, when they were just girls. "And what happened to them?" Harlow prompted when Isaiah fell silent. "They vanished, sir, in the summer of 1823. There was talk that they had tried to escape, but no one ever found them. Some said they made it to freedom in the north. Others," his voice dropped to almost a whisper, "others said they were punished for practicing their old ways, for putting curses on those who mistreated them." Colonel Blackwood stepped forward, his patience clearly at an end. "That's quite enough, Isaiah. Return to your quarters. The rest of you continue with the excavation. Sheriff, I expect you to handle this matter with the proper respect for my family's reputation. These are clearly very old remains, and there's no evidence of any wrongdoing." But Sheriff Harlow wasn't so easily dismissed. He had been law enforcement in Charleston County for over 20 years, and his instincts told him there was more to this story than ancient superstitions. "I'll need to conduct a proper investigation, Colonel. These individuals may have met with foul play." "Do what you must," Blackwood replied coldly. "But be aware that dragging my family name through unsubstantiated rumors will not be tolerated." As the sheriff ordered his deputies to secure the site, he noticed something clutched in the bony hand of one of the skeletons. Carefully, he reached down and extracted what appeared to be a small cloth pouch, dark with age and soil. The contents shifted within as he lifted it, producing a faint rattling sound. "Don't open that!" Isaiah called out suddenly, his voice tight with fear. Sheriff Harlow looked up in surprise. "And why not?" "It's a gris-gris bag," Isaiah said, his voice trembling. "A conjure charm. If these are indeed the Freeman sisters, then that bag contains powerful magic. Opening it could release whatever curse they were working when they died." Colonel Blackwood rolled his eyes. "For God's sake, Sheriff, don't tell me you believe in this voodoo nonsense." Harlow studied the small pouch in his hand. He considered himself a rational man, but he had lived in the South long enough to develop a healthy respect for the unknown. Without commenting, he carefully wrapped the pouch in his handkerchief and placed it in his coat pocket. "I'll have Dr. Reynolds examine these remains," he said, referring to the county medical examiner. "And I'll be conducting interviews with some of your older workers, Colonel. I'd appreciate your cooperation." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "My house is open to you, Sheriff, but I warn you, stirring up ancient history will do no one any good." As Sheriff Harlow prepared to leave, he noticed Isaiah watching him, the old man's eyes fixed on the pocket where he had placed the gris-gris bag. There was undisguised fear in the worker's gaze. "You be careful with that, Sheriff," Isaiah said quietly. "The Freeman sisters didn't die easy, and they don't rest easy neither. Dr. James Reynolds was a man of science, trained at the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, and firmly committed to rational explanation. But even he was puzzled by what the examination of the remains revealed. These women died violently, there's no doubt about that," he told Sheriff Harlow the following day, as they stood in the small examination room behind Reynolds's office. "Both show evidence of extensive trauma, broken bones, particularly in the arms and hands, suggesting defensive wounds." "So they were murdered," Harlow said grimly. "Almost certainly. But there are anomalies." Reynolds gestured to the chains that had been removed from the remains and now lay on a separate table. "These chains were broken, not unlocked. You can see where the metal has been sheared through. It would take tremendous force to do this, far more than human strength could apply without tools." Harlow examined the broken chains. The metal was indeed sheared cleanly through in multiple places. "Could they have been cut after death? Part of the burial?" Reynolds shook his head. "That doesn't explain the positioning. Based on the remains, these women were still alive and struggling when the chains broke. And there's more." He pointed to several dark stains on the tattered fabric that still clung to the bones. "This appears to be blood, but not from the victims. It's spattered on their clothing from an external source. Someone else's blood. Their killers, perhaps. Possibly. I've taken samples for further examination, but Sheriff... Reynolds hesitated, uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his face. There's something else you should see. He moved to a small desk where several objects recovered from the grave had been laid out for examination. Among them was a leather-bound book, its pages swollen and warped from years underground. This was found clutched between their bodies, Reynolds said, carefully opening the book to reveal pages filled with handwritten text in faded ink. It appears to be a journal or diary, written partly in English and partly in what I believe is French Creole. Harlow leaned closer. Can you read any of it? Only portions. The English entries seem to document the sisters' lives on the plantation. But Sheriff, look at this. Reynolds turned to the final pages of the journal. This entry is dated July 16th, 1823. It appears to be the last thing written before they died. Harlow read the faded words aloud. They come for us tonight. We hear them gathering outside. Adeline says we must complete the ritual before they break down the door. The blood sacrifice has been made. The chains of bondage shall become the chains of vengeance. What is bound in hatred shall be loosed in power. Death is not the end, but the beginning. We are the first. 7 generations shall know our justice. A chill ran down the sheriff's spine as he finished reading. What does that mean? 7 generations shall know our justice. Reynolds shook his head. I don't know, but there's one more thing. He carefully turned the journal to the very last page, where a crude family tree had been drawn. At the top was the name Augustus Blackwood, followed by his son Jeremiah Blackwood and grandson Thaddeus Blackwood, who was just a child in 1823. Beneath the family tree, written in a different hand than the rest of the journal, were the words, 7 generations to suffer, 7 souls to claim. The debt will be paid in full. Sheriff Harlow stared at the ominous words. Despite his rational mind, he couldn't help but remember Isaiah's warnings about the curse of the Freeman sisters. I need to speak with Colonel Blackwood again, he said, closing the journal, and I'd like to take this with me as evidence. Reynolds nodded, carefully wrapping the journal in cloth. Be careful, Sheriff. Whatever happened to these women, it was brutal and deliberate, and if the Colonel's family was involved, then I'm poking a hornet's nest. Harlow finished grimly. Wouldn't be the first time. As Sheriff Harlow drove his buggy back toward Blackwood Manor, the gris-gris bag seemed to burn in his pocket like a hot coal. He had decided not to show it to Dr. Reynolds, partly because he knew the physician would dismiss it as superstitious nonsense, but partly because of a strange reluctance he couldn't quite explain. The bag felt personal somehow, as if it had been left specifically for him to find. When he arrived at Blackwood Manor, he found the household in an unexpected state of chaos. Servants rushed about with grim expressions, and as he approached the main house, he saw Dr. Reynolds' younger brother, Dr. Thomas Reynolds, emerging from the front door. "Doctor!" Harlow called, hurrying to intercept him. "What's happened?" Thomas Reynolds looked exhausted, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "It's the Colonel's son, Edward. He collapsed this morning with a high fever. I've never seen anything progress so rapidly. He was perfectly healthy yesterday." A sense of foreboding washed over Harlow. "How is he now?" The doctor's expression was grave. "I've done what I can, but—" He shook his head. "The fever is unlike anything I've encountered. It's as if he's burning from the inside out, and there are strange marks appearing on his skin, like chains." Harlow's blood ran cold. "Like chains!" Raised welts in the pattern of links, wrapping around his wrists and ankles. "I can't explain it medically." Dr. Reynolds lowered his voice. "The house slaves are already whispering about a curse. Something about the bodies found on the property yesterday." Before Harlow could respond, a woman's scream echoed from inside the house. Both men turned toward the sound, then rushed up the steps and through the open door. They followed the continuing sounds of distress to the second floor, where they found Elizabeth Blackwood, the colonel's wife, collapsed outside her son's bedroom door, her lady's maid attempting to comfort her. Inside the room, Colonel Blackwood stood rigid at his son's bedside, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. On the bed lay Edward Blackwood, 30 years old, and until yesterday the picture of robust health. Now his body was contorted in a grotesque pose, his back arched unnaturally, his limbs twisted as if struggling against invisible restraints. His skin was marked with angry red welts in the distinct pattern of chain links wrapping around his wrists, ankles, and neck. And he was very clearly dead, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling in final frozen terror. "What in God's name?" Harlow breathed, taking in the horrific scene. Colonel Blackwood turned slowly to face him, and for the first time the sheriff saw genuine fear in the man's cold eyes. "This is your doing," Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You disturbed their rest. You've brought this upon my family." Dr. Reynolds pushed past them to examine the body, but Harlow knew it was too late for medical intervention. Whatever had killed Edward Blackwood was beyond the realm of conventional medicine. "Colonel," Harlow said carefully, "I need to know everything about the Freeman sisters. Not the superstitions, not the ghost stories, the truth. What happened to them in 1823? For a long moment, Blackwood was silent, his gaze returning to his son's twisted corpse. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders and regained some of his customary composure. "My study," he said curtly. "Now." Colonel Blackwood's study was a testament to the family's wealth and status. Leather-bound books, lined mahogany shelves, a massive desk dominated the center of the room, and portraits of Blackwood ancestors gazed sternly from the walls. The colonel poured himself a generous measure of brandy before speaking, not offering any to the sheriff. "What I'm about to tell you goes no further than this room," Blackwood said, after taking a long swallow of the amber liquid. "The reputation of my family depends on your discretion." Harlow remained standing, his posture making it clear that he was here in an official capacity. "I'll determine what needs to be disclosed once I've heard the facts, Colonel." Blackwood's mouth tightened, but he continued. "The Freeman sisters were indeed purchased by my father in 1815, brought from Haiti after the slave rebellions there. They were 12 years old at the time, twins. Their mother was said to be a practitioner of voodoo who had been killed during the fighting." He took another drink before continuing. "From the beginning they were difficult, rebellious. They refused to speak English for the first year, communicating only in Creole with each other. They were intelligent, though. Once they decided to learn, they picked up English quickly. By the time they were 16, they could read and write better than many white children of the area." "How did they manage that?" Harlow asked. "Teaching slaves to read was illegal." Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "My mother, she was a pious woman who believed all souls should have access to the Bible. She taught many of our house slaves to read scripture." His expression darkened. "But the Freeman girls went further. They began stealing books from my father's library, history, philosophy, even my father's legal texts, and they started spreading dangerous ideas among the other slaves." "What kind of ideas?" "Freedom, equality, the same poison that had led to the massacres in Haiti." Blackwood refilled his glass. "But that wasn't the worst of it. They also practiced their mother's religion in secret, voodoo rituals in the slave quarters at night, animal sacrifices, dolls made to resemble overseers who had punished them. And these dolls, did anything happen to the overseers?" Blackwood hesitated. "There were incidents. One overseer who had whipped Josephine for insolence was found the next day unable to move his right arm, the one that had held the whip. Another who had made improper advances toward Adeline woke screaming in the night that invisible hands were choking him. He was dead by morning. Could these deaths have had natural causes?" Harlow pressed. "Perhaps, but the timing was too convenient to ignore." Blackwood set down his glass with a sharp click. By 1823, The sisters had become a serious problem. The other slaves either feared them or revered them. Work was being disrupted. Discipline was breaking down. So what happened to them? Colonel Blackwood was silent for a long moment, staring into his brandy as if it might provide an easier answer than the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. My father decided they needed to be sold away from the plantation, separated from each other to break their influence. When they learned of this plan, they escaped. They were found 3 days later hiding in a barn on a neighboring property. He paused. They had with them a book of spells, various items for their rituals, and most disturbing of all, a crude drawing of my father with his throat cut. And then? Harlow prompted when Blackwood fell silent again. They were brought back in chains. My father was not a gentle man in the best of circumstances, and he believed these girls had used black magic to kill his employees and were plotting to murder him. Blackwood's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. He decided to make an example of them. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Harlow felt a cold anger building inside him, but kept his voice level. What exactly did your father do, Colonel? He had them whipped, publicly, in front of all the other slaves. Blackwood wouldn't meet Harlow's eyes now. But they wouldn't break. They didn't cry out, didn't beg for mercy. Instead, they began chanting in their native tongue, growing louder with each lash of the whip. And then, something happened. Something I cannot explain. For the first time, real emotion broke through Blackwood's composed exterior, not grief or remorse, but fear. The chains binding them to the whipping post began to glow red-hot. The overseer administering the punishment screamed that his hands were burning, and then the chains shattered. Harlow thought of the broken chains they had found with the bodies, sheared through by some inexplicable force. What happened next? Chaos. Panic. The sisters were free but badly injured from the whipping. They should have been too weak to stand, let alone run. But they did. They ran straight for my father. Blackwood drained the last of his brandy. 2 slaves tried to intervene to protect my father. The sisters. The only way I can describe it is that they tore through them, not with weapons, with their bare hands. There was blood everywhere. And your father? He shot them. Blackwood said it simply, flatly. Both of them, at point-blank range. They fell at his feet, still reaching for him, still chanting those words. What words? 7 generations shall know our justice, 7 souls to claim. The debt will be paid in full, Blackwood quoted mechanically, and Harlow recognized the same phrase from the journal. My father ordered their bodies buried in secret behind the slave quarters. No markers, nothing to indicate they had ever existed. And he forbade anyone from ever speaking their names again. Harlow absorbed this grim account, trying to reconcile it with the evidence they had found. If your father shot them, why were they found still chained? And why bury them with the journal that documented their curse? I don't know, Blackwood admitted. I was only 10 years old when it happened. I saw the confrontation, saw my father shoot them, but I was hustled away before they were buried. Perhaps my father wanted to ensure they remained bound, even in death. As for the journal, he shook his head. Perhaps someone else placed it there. One of the slaves who believed in their power. And now your son is dead, Harlow said quietly, with marks like chains on his body. Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly blazing with the same cold fury that had made him a feared master. Are you suggesting my son's death is the result of some slave's curse from 16 years ago? That's absurd. Edward died of natural causes, some sudden fever. A fever that left chain marks on his skin? Harlow challenged. Colonel, I'm not saying I believe in curses, but something very strange is happening here, and it started when we uncovered those remains. Then rebury them, Blackwood snapped. Put them back where they were found and cover them up. Perhaps that will end this. Whatever this is. Harlow shook his head. It's too late for that. This is now a murder investigation, your father's killing of the Freeman sisters. And possibly now the suspicious death of your son. Blackwood rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. My father did what was necessary to maintain order on his plantation. No court in South Carolina would convict a man for putting down a slave rebellion. And as for Edward's death, if you suggest to anyone that it was anything other than natural causes, I will use every ounce of my influence to destroy you." The threat hung in the air between them. Harlow knew it wasn't idle. The Blackwoods had enough power and connections to end his career, or worse, but he had sworn an oath to uphold the law, and 2 women had been murdered, regardless of their status as slaves. "I'll continue my investigation, Colonel," he said firmly. "I suggest you cooperate fully. In the meantime, I'd recommend your family leave the plantation until we determine what exactly is happening here." Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Run away from my own home because of dead slaves and superstitious nonsense. Never. The Blackwoods do not flee from threats, Sheriff. We eliminate them." As Sheriff Harlow left Blackwood Manor, the gris-gris bag in his pocket seemed heavier than before. He had a decision to make. Follow the evidence where it led, potentially bringing down one of the most powerful families in South Carolina, or accept the convenient explanation of natural causes and bury the truth along with the Freeman sisters. But as he rode back toward town, he couldn't shake the image of Edward Blackwood's body, contorted in death, marked with chains that weren't physically present. Nor could he forget the final words written in the sisters' journal: "7 generations shall know our justice, 7 souls to claim." Edward Blackwood was the first. Who would be next? The death of Edward Blackwood sent shockwaves through Charleston society. The official cause was listed as sudden fever of unknown origin, but rumors spread quickly. Many connected his death to the discovery of the bodies on the plantation, though few knew the full story of the Freeman sisters. Sheriff Harlow continued his investigation discreetly. He interviewed older slaves from the plantation, many of whom remembered the sisters or had heard stories about them. The accounts varied in details, but all agreed on certain facts. The twins had possessed unusual abilities. They had resisted their enslavement through both overt and subtle means, and their deaths had been violent and public. Most disturbing were the consistent reports that after being shot by Augustus Blackwood, the sisters had not died immediately. Instead, with their final breaths, they had uttered a curse upon the Blackwood line. 7 generations would suffer, 7 souls would be claimed. The first generation was Augustus himself, making Jeremiah the second and his children the third. One elderly woman who had been a house slave at the time provided the most detailed account. Her name was Martha, and she had been just 16 when the Freeman sisters died. "I helped prepare their bodies for burial," she told Sheriff Harlow, her voice quavering with age and emotion. "Colonel Augustus insisted they be buried still in their chains as a symbol that they had never truly escaped bondage. But those chains—" She shook her head in wonder. "They kept breaking. Every time we secured one, it would crack and fall away. It took 3 sets before they would stay fastened." "What about the journal?" Harlow asked. "Do you know how it came to be buried with them?" Martha's eyes widened. "You found their book. Lord have mercy." She crossed herself, a gesture that blended Christian symbolism with what Harlow suspected were older African movements. "That book contained their power. Josephine slipped it to me just before they were taken to the whipping post. Made me promise to place it with their bodies if they died. Said it would ensure their spirits could continue their work." "And what work was that, Martha?" The old woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, though they were alone. "Justice, Sheriff. The sisters didn't believe in revenge. They believed in justice. They said the Blackwoods and all slave owners would eventually face judgment for their crimes, if not in this world, then in the next." Harlow considered this. "Do you believe they had powers, that they could curse the Blackwood family?" Martha straightened in her chair, dignity evident in her posture despite her years. "I believe they had knowledge, Sheriff. Knowledge of things most folks have forgotten or choose to ignore. Call it magic, call it spiritual power. It was real. I saw it with my own eyes." After interviewing Martha and others who had known the sisters, Harlow returned to his office to review his notes. He had the journal, translated as best as possible by a French-speaking teacher from Charleston. He had the testimonies. He had the physical evidence of the broken chains and the remains themselves, still in Dr. Reynolds' keeping. And he had the gris-gris bag, which he had still not opened. As night fell, Harlow found himself alone in his office, the bag sitting on his desk before him. Despite his rational nature, he had developed a superstitious reluctance to examine its contents. But if he was to get to the bottom of this case, he needed to consider all the evidence. With careful fingers, he untied the drawstring and gently emptied the contents onto his desk. Inside were several small objects: a lock of blonde hair tied with thread, unmistakably from a Blackwood given the distinctive pale gold color that ran in the family; 7 small stones, each marked with a strange symbol; a tiny cloth doll with no features except for black thread forming a chain pattern across its body, and a folded piece of paper. With growing unease, Harlow unfolded the paper to find a list of names: Augustus Blackwood, Jeremiah Blackwood, Edward Blackwood, Thomas Blackwood, Jeremiah's younger son, Rebecca Blackwood, Edward's daughter, blank, blank. The first 3 names were crossed out. Augustus had died of a stroke in 1830, 7 years after killing the Freeman sisters. Jeremiah was still alive, but his name was crossed out nonetheless. And Edward, who had died just yesterday, was the 3rd name on the list. A cold sweat broke out on Harlow's forehead. If this list represented the 7 souls to claim, then Thomas Blackwood and young Rebecca were next. And after them, 2 more Blackwoods who had yet to be born or named. The implications were staggering. Either someone was systematically killing the Blackwood family members according to a list created 16 years ago, or something truly supernatural was at work. Neither possibility was comforting. Harlow carefully returned the items to the bag and secured it in his desk drawer. Then he wrote a hasty note to his deputy, instructing him to check on the Blackwood family first thing in the morning, with particular attention to Thomas Blackwood's welfare. But his warning came too late. As dawn broke over Charleston, a messenger arrived at the sheriff's office with urgent news. Thomas Blackwood had been found dead in his bed, his body bearing the same mysterious chain marks as his brother's, and Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood was missing. The search for Colonel Blackwood consumed the next day. His horse was found wandering near the edge of the plantation, suggesting he had set out on horseback during the night, but had never reached his destination. Sheriff Harlow organized search parties to comb the vast property, focusing particularly on the area where the Freeman sisters had been buried. As dusk approached with no sign of the colonel, Harlow found himself drawn back to that site. The excavation had been expanded since the initial discovery, revealing not just the graves of the sisters, but evidence of other burials as well. At least 5 additional bodies, all interred without coffins or markers. More troublesome slaves? Harlow asked Isaiah, who had insisted on accompanying him despite the growing darkness. The old man shook his head. Those who supported the sisters. After their deaths, anyone suspected of sharing their beliefs or helping them was punished severely. Some didn't survive the punishment. Harlow surveyed the grim excavation site, now illuminated by lanterns as the search continued into the evening. How could something like this happen without authorities knowing? Isaiah's laugh was bitter. Begging your pardon, Sheriff, but the authorities didn't much care what happened to slaves in those days. Still don't, mostly. It was a fair point, and one that made Harlow uncomfortable with his own role in a system that too often looked the other way. Before he could respond, a shout came from the direction of the old slave quarters, now abandoned and partially collapsed. "Over here! We found something!" Harlow and Isaiah hurried toward the voice. In what had once been the floor of the largest cabin, the searchers had discovered a trap door leading to a small cellar, and in that cellar they found Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood. He was alive, but barely. His wrists and ankles were bound with chains that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. They were modern chains, not antiques, with no sign of how they had been placed on him or by whom. His skin beneath the metal was raw and blistered, as if the chains were burning him, though they felt cool to the touch when Harlow examined them. Most disturbing of all was the colonel's mental state. He was conscious but unresponsive, his eyes wide and staring, his lips moving constantly in what appeared to be silent conversation with someone only he could see. "Get these chains off him," Harlow ordered, but the task proved impossible. Every key they tried failed to fit the locks, and when they attempted to cut the chains, the metal resisted even the strongest tools. "It's their doing," Isaiah said quietly, standing back from the rescue attempt. "The Freeman sisters have claimed him." Harlow wanted to dismiss the old man's words as superstition, but standing there in the dim cellar, watching Blackwood communicate with invisible entities as chains from no earthly source bound him, it was difficult to maintain his skepticism. "We need to get him to town," Harlow decided. "Carry him as he is, and someone ride ahead to fetch Dr. Reynolds." But as they lifted the colonel to carry him from the cellar, he suddenly spoke, his voice clear but utterly unlike his usual authoritative tone. Instead, he sounded like a young woman with a distinct Creole accent. 7 generations, 7 souls. The debt must be paid. Then his body went rigid, his back arching in the same unnatural posture that had marked his son's death, and before the horrified search party's eyes, the chains binding him began to glow with an internal red heat. Blackwood screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the abandoned slave quarters and across the plantation grounds. When the screaming stopped, Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood was dead, the chains that had bound him now broken into pieces that fell away from his lifeless body. On his exposed wrists and ankles, the skin was burned in perfect chain-link patterns, the wounds cauterized by the inexplicable heat. Sheriff Harlow stood in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just witnessed. There was no rational explanation for chains that appeared from nowhere, heated without any visible source of flame, and then broke apart on their own. No scientific principle could account for Blackwood speaking in a voice not his own, uttering words that echoed those found in the sisters' journal. 3 souls claimed, Isaiah said softly. 4 more to go. The news of Colonel Blackwood's bizarre death, coming so soon after his son's, created a sensation in Charleston. The official report listed the cause as misadventure, the details kept deliberately vague to protect the family's reputation and to avoid the mass panic that might ensue if the full circumstances were made public. But rumors spread nonetheless. Slaves whispered of justice, long delayed finally being served. White society spoke in hushed tones of curses and voodoo. The remaining Blackwoods, the colonel's widow Elizabeth, Thomas, the deaths of Edward and Thomas Blackwood, followed so closely by their father Colonel Jeremiah's inexplicable demise, sent waves of fear through Charleston society. Within 1 week, 3 generations of Blackwood men had perished, each bearing the same mysterious chain marks on their skin. Elizabeth Blackwood, the colonel's widow, fled the plantation with her granddaughter Rebecca, taking refuge with relatives in Virginia. The once proud Blackwood Manor stood empty, its halls echoing with secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Sheriff William Harlow found himself at a crossroads both professional and spiritual. The rational lawman in him demanded logical explanations, while the evidence before his eyes pointed to forces beyond his understanding. The gris-gris bag and its ominous list remained locked in his desk drawer, the 4th name, Rebecca Blackwood, still uncrossed. "What will you do now, Sheriff?" Dr. Reynolds asked as they stood in his examination room, the bodies of the 3 Blackwood men laid out before them. "The official reports cite natural causes and misadventure, but we both know that's not the truth." Harlow had no answer. As a man of law, his duty was to investigate crimes and bring perpetrators to justice. But how did one arrest a curse? How did one prosecute the vengeful spirits of murdered slaves? The Freeman sisters' journal had been fully translated by now, revealing a history far more complex than the simplified version Colonel Blackwood had shared. Adeline and Josephine Freeman had not merely been rebellious slaves practicing forbidden voodoo. They had been organizing a calculated resistance, using both their education and spiritual practices to undermine the plantation system from within. Their final ritual, performed the night before their public punishment, had not been aimed at escape or revenge, but at what they called generational justice. The journal described it as a balancing of scales across time, where the perpetrators of great evil would face judgment not just in their own lifetime, but through their bloodline. 7 generations of Blackwoods would face 7 souls claimed, one for each generation of Freeman family members who had lived and died in bondage before the twins. The debt of suffering would be repaid in full. Perhaps, Dr. Reynolds suggested carefully, the best course of action would be to give the Freeman sisters a proper burial. Return their remains to consecrated ground with appropriate respect. It seemed a reasonable step, though Harlow doubted it would end what had been set in motion 16 years earlier. Nevertheless, arrangements were made for the sisters to be reinterred in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Not the White Cemetery, of course, but at least a recognized burial ground, rather than an unmarked grave on plantation soil. The day of the reburial was overcast, the air heavy with impending rain. Despite the private nature of the ceremony, a small crowd had gathered, mostly older black residents of Charleston, many former slaves who had known the sisters or heard tales of their power. Isaiah was there, his weathered face solemn, as he watched the 2 simple coffins being lowered into freshly dug graves. Martha had come as well, now so frail she needed support to stand, but determined to witness this moment of belated dignity for the Freeman sisters. Sheriff Harlow stood slightly apart, hat in hand, his expression troubled. As the first shovelful of earth fell onto the coffins, he felt the gree bag in his pocket grow suddenly warm, almost hot against his leg. He had brought it intending to place it in the grave with the sisters, a returning of their power to its source. But before he could step forward to do so, Martha approached him, her rheumy eyes sharp with awareness. "The debt is not yet paid in full, Sheriff," she said quietly. 4 souls remain to be claimed. Harlow frowned. "Rebecca Blackwood is just a child, no more than 7 years old. Surely she cannot be held accountable for her grandfather's crimes." Martha's expression was neither cruel nor compassionate, but something more complex, the face of one who had witnessed too much injustice to be moved by individual tragedy. "How old were the Freeman twins when they were taken from their mother in Haiti?" she asked. "How many children were born into bondage on Blackwood land, never knowing freedom? The scales must balance, Sheriff. That is the way of things." Before Harlow could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the cemetery. A carriage had arrived, its driver urging the horses at dangerous speed. It careened to a halt near the burial site, and a woman emerged, Elizabeth Blackwood, her face pale with terror. "Sheriff," she called out, stumbling toward Harlow, "you must help us. It's Rebecca. She's—" Her words dissolved into sobs as she clutched at his coat. "Mrs. Blackwood, what's happened?" Harlow steadied the distraught woman, dread pooling in his stomach. "The chains," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes wild. "They appeared from nowhere, wrapping around her arms while she slept. She woke screaming. The metal was burning her skin. We tried to remove them, but nothing would break the locks. She's in the carriage now. Please, you must save her." Harlow ran to the carriage, throwing open the door to find young Rebecca huddled on the seat, her small wrists and ankles encircled by heavy iron chains that seemed designed for an adult. The metal links glowed with a dull red heat where they touched her skin, yet the fabric of her dress showed no signs of burning. The child's eyes met Harlow's, and in that moment, something shifted in his understanding of the world. For the eyes that looked back at him were not those of a frightened 7-year-old girl, but ancient, knowing eyes that had witnessed centuries of suffering. 7 generations, Rebecca said, but the voice was not her own. It held the same Creole accent he had heard from Colonel Blackwood before his death. 7 souls, the debt must be paid. The chains around her wrists suddenly shattered, fragments of hot metal flying outward. Rebecca's body went rigid, her back arching in the now familiar posture that had preceded death for the Blackwood men. Harlow lunged forward, driven by instinct to save the child, but a hand on his arm pulled him back. Isaiah, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "You cannot interfere," the old man said firmly. "What was set in motion must be completed." "She's an innocent child," Harlow protested. Isaiah's expression hardened. And how many innocent children suffered and died under Blackwood ownership? How many families were torn apart when children were sold away from their parents? There is no justice that does not acknowledge all victims, Sheriff. Inside the carriage, Rebecca Blackwood's small body convulsed once more, then went still. The chains that had bound her crumbled to rust, leaving behind the now familiar markings on her skin. Elizabeth Blackwood's scream cut through the cemetery, a sound of primal maternal grief that silenced even the birds. She collapsed beside the carriage, unconscious from the shock and horror of watching her granddaughter die before her eyes. As Harlow stood frozen, the gris-gris bag in his pocket began to burn with such intensity that he cried out, pulling it free and dropping it to the ground. The drawstring loosened of its own accord, and the contents spilled out onto the freshly turned earth beside the Freeman sisters' graves. The list of names was now visible to all present. The first 4 names were crossed out: Augustus Blackwood, Jeremiah Blackwood, Edward Blackwood, and Rebecca Blackwood. The 5th name had been revealed, Elizabeth Blackwood, but it was the final 2 spaces on the list that caused Harlow's blood to run cold. Where before they had been blank, names now appeared in a handwriting he recognized from the sisters' journal. William Harlow. William Harlow, Jr. "No," Harlow whispered, staggering backward. "That's impossible. I'm not a Blackwood." Martha approached, bending with difficulty to examine the list. "Blood tells many stories, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Some of them buried deep." "What are you saying?" Harlow demanded, though a terrible suspicion was already forming in his mind. "Augustus Blackwood was not a faithful husband," Martha said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Your mother worked in the Blackwood house as a maid before she married. 9 months after she left that position, you were born." The world seemed to tilt beneath Harlow's feet. "That would make me the Colonel's half-brother," Martha confirmed. "And your son, the 7th generation from Augustus Blackwood." Harlow thought of his 16-year-old son, currently away at school in Boston. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "I've done nothing to deserve this. Neither has my son." Isaiah stepped forward, his face grave but not unkind. "The sins of the father are visited upon the children," he said, "not because the children are guilty, but because evil ripples outward through generations, touching all connected to its source. What you are experiencing now, this fear for your child, this sense of helpless injustice, is what the Freeman sisters felt, what all slaves felt when their children were taken from them, punished for crimes they did not commit, made to suffer for a system they had no hand in creating." As if in response to Isaiah's words, the chains that had bound Rebecca Blackwood rose from the carriage floor, hovering in the air for a moment before flying toward Harlow with supernatural speed. He raised his arms in a futile attempt at protection, but the metal wrapped around his wrists with the precision of a living thing, the links connecting and locking with an ominous click. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Not just the physical burning where the heated metal touched his skin, but a deeper anguish that flooded his mind with visions. A young woman torn from her family in Haiti, the ocean journey in the hold of a slave ship, years of degradation and abuse on Blackwood land, and finally the whipping post where the sisters had made their last stand. He felt their pain as they were beaten. He experienced their rage and determination as they summoned their power for one final act of defiance, and he understood, in that moment of perfect empathy, that their curse had never been about revenge, but about understanding, forcing the Blackwood line to experience, generation after generation, what it meant to be bound against one's will, to have one's body treated as property, to face death while chained. "Please," Harlow gasped through the pain, addressing not the crowd of witnesses, but the spirits he now knew were present. "Spare my son. He knows nothing of this history. Take me, but let him live." The burning in the chains intensified, and Harlow fell to his knees beside the open graves. Through tear-blurred eyes, he saw the bones of the Freeman sisters beginning to glow with the same red light as the chains, as if responding to his plea. Martha knelt beside him, her old hands reaching out to touch the chains that bound him. "There may yet be a way," she said urgently. The sisters believed in justice, not blind vengeance. Offer them what they truly sought: acknowledgement, truth, a voice that will not be silenced. Understanding dawned through Harlow's pain. With shaking hands, he withdrew the Freeman sisters' journal from his coat, along with the official report he had prepared on their deaths, the true account, not the sanitized version submitted to his superiors. "I swear," he said, his voice strengthening with conviction, "that your story will be told. The truth of what happened at Blackwood Manor will be recorded. I will ensure that everyone knows how you lived, how you died, and how you sought justice not just for yourselves, but for all who suffered in bondage." He placed the journal and his report on the edge of the grave. "Let my blood be the last claimed in this debt. Let my son be free of this burden, and in return I will dedicate what remains of my life to ensuring that your sacrifice is not forgotten." For a moment, nothing happened. The chains continued to burn, and Harlow prepared himself for the death he had seen claim 4 Blackwoods before him. Then, slowly, the red glow began to fade. The metal cooled, though it did not break or fall away. A voice spoke, not from any living person present, but seeming to emanate from the graves themselves, a harmonious blend of 2 female voices speaking in unison. "The debt may be altered, but not erased. Blood calls for blood, but truth can purchase mercy. You will bear our marks for the remainder of your days, a living testament to what occurred here. Your son will be spared our justice if you fulfill your oath. Should you fail, the 7th soul will be claimed." The chains around Harlow's wrists suddenly contracted, biting deeply into his flesh. He cried out as the metal seemed to meld with his skin, becoming part of him. When the pain subsided, he found the chains had transformed into intricate scars circling his wrists and ankles, permanent shackles that would mark him for life. As he struggled to his feet, the ground beneath the Freeman sisters' graves settled with a finality that suggested more than just earth finding its level. A sense of completion hung in the air, though whether it was justice or merely the conclusion of a long-delayed reckoning, Harlow couldn't say. Elizabeth Blackwood was taken to a sanitarium, her mind shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. The Blackwood plantation was sold, the proceeds used to establish a school for freed slaves, the first of many actions Harlow would take to fulfill his oath. He wrote a complete account of the Freeman sisters and the curse that had claimed 5 lives, including detailed testimonies from those who had known them. Copies were placed in libraries and historical societies throughout the South, though many disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the decades that followed. William Harlow lived for another 32 years, the chain scars on his wrists and ankles serving as a daily reminder of his promise. His son grew to adulthood untouched by the curse, though Harlow told him the full story when he came of age, ensuring the truth would survive even if the written records did not. The Freeman sisters' graves became a secret place of pilgrimage for those who knew their story. Flowers would appear mysteriously on the anniversary of their deaths. Small offerings, coins, handmade dolls, locks of hair would be found placed atop their headstones. And on certain nights, particularly when injustice against black Americans was at its height, witnesses reported seeing two young women in tattered dresses walking among the graves, their wrists and ankles encircled by broken chains that glowed with an inner fire, not bound by them, but wearing them as symbols of power reclaimed. Some say that during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the spirits of Adeline and Josephine Freeman appeared at demonstrations, standing silently at the edges of crowds, their presence giving strength to those who risked everything for freedom. Others claim that, even today, in cases where justice has been denied to black victims, investigators sometimes find small gris-gris bags at crime scenes containing lists of names, the perpetrators and their descendants, 7 generations deep. The official history of Charleston makes no mention of the Freeman sisters or the fate of the Blackwood family. The plantation lands have been subdivided, developed into residential neighborhoods whose inhabitants have no idea of the blood that soaked the ground beneath their comfortable homes. But in the oral traditions passed down through generations of black families in South Carolina, the story remains alive, a testament to the power of those who refuse to accept their chains, who fight for justice even from beyond the grave. If you visit Charleston today and find yourself near the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, listen carefully. Some say you can still hear the sisters' voices on the wind, still feel the weight of history pressing down like a physical force. And if you look closely at the weathered headstones, you might find 2 graves side by side, the names nearly erased by time, but the symbol carved below them still distinct. A broken chain, its links scattered but not forgotten. For some debts can never truly be paid, some wounds never fully heal, but in the acknowledgement of past horrors lies the possibility of future redemption. And in the stories we choose to remember and retell, we find both warning and hope. The curse of the Freeman sisters reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it simply takes a different form, working its way through history with the slow but inexorable power of truth that refuses to remain buried. As you leave this video, remember that the ground beneath your feet holds countless untold stories of resistance, courage, and the unquenchable human spirit. Some of those spirits rest easy now. Others still walk among us, waiting for their justice, waiting for their truth to be acknowledged. Turn to God and Jesus Christ for guidance in these troubled times, for only through divine love can we hope to heal the wounds of our shared history and move toward true reconciliation.